In this video, we're going to look at how to prepare your board prior to attaching your copper repoussé. Right here, I've got some masonite, and I'm also going to have a palette here full of paint, as well as a thing of water and a brush. It's up to you, the stage that I'm showing right now, whether you want to do this or not. Some of you might like how the board looks naturally like this, but others of you might want to change the color. So if you want to do that, there's two ways you can go about it. We're going to be using acrylic paint today, and the first way you can change the color would be to stain it using the paint. If you're doing it that way, you're going to have to take just a little bit of paint and add a lot of water to it. So I'm just putting some water here next to this sienna brown that I'm going to be applying, but you could mix any color. It doesn't have to be a brown. If you wanted to do a blue or a pink or whatever, that's fine. I would just suggest making sure that it's going to look good next to the color of the metal. So you want to mix a little bit of the paint into the water until it's about the consistency of watercolor paint. So, you know, a little runny, a little see-through. Don't go and mix the whole amount of acrylic paint in right away, because then you might end up adding a ton of water to it and your palette might overflow. That's not good. You could start by just brushing it on, and you don't have to be super neat about it at first. I found that a lot of times the masonite will repel water a little bit at first, but after your paint sits on there for a little bit, it will start to soak in. So don't freak out if you are seeing areas that keep going back to just the color of the board. Just keep trying to evenly apply the paint from top to bottom. Notice I'm just going from one side straight to the other. And this is a pretty good consistency. It is pretty see-through. If you wanted it thicker, that's fine. I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. But the way that you get this even and work down into that board where it's repelling the water is to just keep going back and forth from top to bottom, bottom to top. And you can see as I go back over it, a lot of those spots are disappearing, and that's just because the board has become saturated and the paint is just soaking down into it. And you just can keep going back and forth until it's almost dry. You might end up with some streaks in it. Sometimes those look like wood grain too, so it's not a huge deal unless you don't like them. So we can pretend that I just kept doing this for a few more minutes. What I'm going to show now is what it looks like with thicker paint. So with the thin paint, you still get a lot of that texture from the board showing. With the thicker paint, which probably won't look real thick right now because I have a layer of water underneath it, you're going to cover up most of that texture. So if you didn't like it, or if you just want like a very vibrant, non-natural color, I would suggest using the thicker paint. And I'm going to just use up all my brown here, but hopefully you can see now what the difference is. And it might be necessary to do 2 coats of the thicker paint, because sometimes even if you don't add water, it's still a little bit see-through, but that's not a huge deal. So after you get your board painted, it's going to have to dry completely. So keep an eye on it. It usually takes about 10-15 minutes. You can look for whether you still see a reflection on your board. That typically means that it's still wet. If it looks dull, that's probably because it's dry. So I'm going to move this board, and I'm going to get one that I did previously. So this one is dry. You can see it's not nearly as shiny looking as that last one. And on this one, we're going to be painting a contrasting color that is going to be behind where the metal goes. So you're going to need a ruler and some tape and a pencil for this. And I have my copper repoussé here. It's still not done, so I'm not going to attach it in this video. But you can see how it might fit on here. So this paper I've cut to be 1 inch longer on both sides than my repoussé. And then you can see how if I put that on top, I have about a 1/2 inch border all the way around, which looks pretty nice. And then I also have about a 1 inch border all the way around my paper. Some of the boards we have might be a little bit bigger, so you might have more than 1 inch all the way around that border that we're going to put on, and that's not a big deal. You just want to double check your math, because it's going to be a little different than what we're looking at right here. So I'm going to move that for now because I don't want to mess it up. I'm going to just take my ruler here, and I've already got the board positioned where I want it because I measured earlier, But you can see if I lay the ruler down, those inch marks are hard to see on that end. Let's switch it. If I lay my ruler down here, I've got about 1 inch on the edge. This board was not cut perfectly, so I had to slide my ruler over just a little bit to get it even. But then if I turn it this way, I've got 1 inch on both sides here. So what I would suggest doing to mark those marks is to start measuring up a little higher than you think you're going to need. So measure, a little over 1 inch up, because we don't want those marks to show up later. And I'm just going to put the ruler so that it's hanging over the edge an even amount. So since it wasn't perfectly 12, it was almost 11 3/4. I've got about 1/8 of an inch hanging off the side. And I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to put a mark right at the 1 inch mark here, so that it's about 1 inch from the edge. I'm going to do the same up here too, 1 inch and 1 inch, so that later I can connect those two marks with tape, because that tape is going to help keep your borders nice and crisp. I'm also going to do that on the other side here. I'm going to measure 1 inch and 1 inch. This side was cut a lot better, so I can just go right to those inch marks from the edge of the board. 1 inch, 1 inch in the middle there too. And, 1 inch and 1 inch. So I've got 3 marks on the long side, just 2 on the shorter side, and that should be enough to keep my tape lined up pretty well. So now I'm going to take masking tape, and I'm just going to cut a piece that's at least as long as that window is going to be. I'm going to lay it right against those marks, and then I'm going to press down so it's really tight against the board, because you don't want your paint getting underneath there. That would not be good. And I'm going to do another one up this side. Oops, that one's not quite long enough. It's better to have it too long than too short, obviously. Seems like your lines stay nicer if you can use just one piece for that whole edge instead of cobbling together 2 or more pieces. That one's a little crooked looking. I'm gonna fix that. So always be checking the edge of your board while you do this too, because even though you have those marks, sometimes they're not perfect. And it's going to be kind of noticeable, if your borders are a little crooked, since they're so close to the edge of this board. Okay. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to take a brush now, and for both of these stages, I recommend using wider brushes. If you use a really small brush, it's going to take forever, and it's not going to be as even. And I'm just going to put my brush into black this time. And when I'm applying the paint, I like to work away from the tape. Sometimes if you brush into the tape, even if you've got it stuck down pretty tight, it still goes underneath. And obviously we don't want that. So I'm going to try to put it on evenly across this whole thing. It's probably going to need 2 coats. So once this first coat dries, I will be going back over it a second time. And I recommend letting your paint dry completely before taking your tape off, because sometimes if it's not dry all the way and you're taking that tape off, the tape hits part of your board or something else and you get paint on that then too. So it doesn't hurt it to dry this way, especially if you've used thin layers that you spread out evenly. If you glop it on, sometimes it does pull up a little bit of the other color, but try not to worry about that. So obviously I'm going to need to get more paint before I can finish this. I recommend starting with less paint than you're going to need, guys, because you can always go back and get more. It's hard to pour this back into the bottle, so please be a little stingy with the paint. In the next video, I'm going to have this tape pulled off and you'll be able to see the nice borders, and then we're going to talk about attaching the copper to your board. And that's the last step before we turn these in. So enjoy and let me know if you need some help.